This is the Almost Timely newsletter for the week of May 21st, 2023. Content authenticity statement: 100% of this issue of the newsletter was written by me, the human. When AI is used to generate content in the newsletter, I'll prominently disclose it. What's on my mind this week? Hot takes on the AI congressional hearing. I took a few hours to read the congressional testimony of Sam Altman from OpenAI, Gary Marcus from NYU, and Christina Montgomery from IBM in depth, which you can find. There's a link in the newsletter. It is always challenging reading congressional testimonial, mainly because Congress people spend so much damn time posturing in their questions that half the transcript is usually a waste. As an idea, maybe I need to write a prompt for GPT-4 that distills down the senatorial and congressional questions to just the question and preserves the answers of the witnesses, which is the part that I really care about, in order to make these transcripts more bearable. Anyway, I have some in-depth thoughts about the way some of the AI leaders and elected officials are thinking about AI, and I'm not super encouraged. First, and this is an important one, a few folks have asked why AI business leaders are calling for regulation of AI. It is not entirely altruistic. Some of the suggestions, like a regulatory body for licensing of AI models, would inherently benefit those companies with deep pockets to be able to comply with regulations, squeezing out smaller competitors. As with all things governmental and political, anytime someone is lobbying for something, you should spend some time thinking about what's in it for them. Where's the benefit to them? Give that some thought. On the topic of regulating models, that ship has sailed. With so many excellent and ever-evolving open source models, the door to regulating the models themselves, that door is closed. And here's a really critical part. It is important to distinguish models from fine-tunes, which is a key point that was entirely omitted in the congressional testimony. Regulating models themselves won't change the impact that fine-tuning has in terms of the potential harm that AI can do. Let me explain in terms of pizza. Building an AI model is like baking a pizza from scratch, and I mean all the way from scratch. You have to go grow a field of wheat, harvest it, dry it, mill it, and turn it into flour. You have to grow tomatoes. You have to mine salt. You have to dig a well for water. You got to grow a field of sugarcane, raise bees, or something for the sweeteners if you want to use that in your pizza sauce. You have to grow grazing land to raise cows to get milk that you need for pizza cheese. So if you were to bake a pizza literally from scratch, it would be an enormous, very expensive enterprise. Fine-tuning an AI model is like taking a pizza that already exists and adjusting the proportion of ingredients. I mean, get one of those like store-bought pizzas, right? That it says just heat in your oven. Maybe you add a bunch of chili flakes to it, right? That's going to dramatically change the pizza and how it tastes, but you didn't change the underlying model that much, right? So somebody else went through all that effort to make this pizza from scratch, and you just add more toppings. You can do a lot of harm to someone by giving them, say, a super spicy pizza, even if the base pizza itself was harmless, or giving them a pizza with toppings they're allergic to, right? The base pizza isn't to blame, but it was part of the delivery mechanism of the harmful impact. That's the difference between an AI model and a fine-tune. Here's why this is important. Building a model is incredibly resource intensive. You need massive amounts of compute power, a lot of time, properly labeled data, and huge amounts of it, and human resources to produce the base model. This limits the production of these really large models to the big tech companies, right? The folks who can afford that kind of hardware. On the other hand, fine-tuning a model, that can be done by you or me with nothing more than a gaming laptop. Going back to our pizza analogy, it's the difference between the entire supply chain needed to make a pizza and you or me just sprinkling, cilantro on the pizza or whatever. The potential for harm for misusing AI can come from the model. It absolutely can. Or it can come from someone's fine-tuning of the model, right? You can get someone, say, like a hostile Russian hacker fine-tuning a model that's designed to try and break into banks. regulating the models is not going to solve the fine-tuning issue, and there legitimately isn't a sensible way to do so that doesn't basically require constant government surveillance of pretty much everyone, and I think we can mostly agree that that's a bad idea. Why? Because some of the best models today are now open source models that literally anyone, you, me, the dog, the cat, right, can download these things. You can download them for free and use them today, and they're very good as is. But you can also fine-tune them on your own to do exactly what you want them to do. Right? So again, if you're a Russian who wants to justify the illegal invasion of Ukraine, you can download a model and fine-tune it to make it spit out propaganda. So in terms of regulating models, that horse has left the barn. So that key takeaway, that the powers that be are discussing regulating something that's already happened and can't be taken back, is, I think, critical to understanding where the government, in this case the USA government, is in their understanding of AI. The USA government is behind, far behind, particularly organizations and entities like the EU, way far behind the tech community, and they need to catch up quickly or else they'll be legislating for problems that no longer exist, right? It'd be like today trying to legislate Twitter, right? Good luck with that. The second major area where there was a lot of discussion in the hearing was around liability. Now, we've established that AI-created content is, at least in the USA, ineligible for copyright because it wasn't made by humans, and copyright law only applies to human-made creations. The big question now is, who is liable for an AI model's output? And there's a couple of precedents here that we could look into. None of them are an exact fit. Full disclosure, I am not a lawyer. I have never been a lawyer, and I cannot give legal advice. If you need a lawyer who specializes in AI, go look up my friend Ruth Carter. They do AI law. They can give legal advice. I cannot. So take everything I'm about to say through that lens. The first precedent is the copyright one. Because machines are ineligible for copyright, this implies that their output basically has no rights and, in a sense then, no responsibility for what they create either. This makes a good deal of sense. If a machine spits out, say, like racist content by itself, it hasn't done anything wrong. Someone else today has to take that content and publish it, distribute it, market it, do something with it, and it's that part, that action, that could be in violation of the law. So it's not the model that's doing something wrong, it's the person who's taking the model output. The second precedent, and one that came up a lot in the hearings, was Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This law essentially indemnifies carriers for the content that goes across their networks. So, for example, T-Mobile, my mobile company, has no legal responsibility for what I do with my devices on their network. If I distribute illegal content, they can't be sued for what I'm doing, for my actions. I can be held responsible for it, but they cannot. This act is what has caused social media to be such a dumpster fire. Right? Companies like Twitter and Facebook have no legal liability for what people post on those networks, even if it's stuff that is outright harmful, right? Even stuff that is dangerous. They have no responsibility. In the USA, the Supreme Court here just upheld this law, so there's little chance of that changing anytime soon. So when a machine, when an AI model does something wrong, who owns the mistake? The current thinking, unsurprisingly by big tech companies, is that they are not at fault for what their models create. And I can see this point. An automaker is not liable for an accident that I cause, right? Unless it can be proven that there's a defect in the car or the car maker failed to warn vehicle owners that doing something dumb would cause a crash. However, the loophole in the argument around AI is that automakers have safety standards they have to adhere to, right? They have requirements that the government sets down and says this is what a car should do and what should not do. You know, if your car should not just spontaneously burst into flames. And so if an automaker adheres to those standards, they are then indemnified because they did their job, they met those standards, and they can't be held accountable then for car accidents that did not involve meeting those standards. AI does not have those standards. And so the comparison of AI models to automakers is really not all that compelling. If we had standards for the models that they had to comply with, then you could indemnify AI model creators if someone used a model in a way that was not intended, right? Just like a chainsaw. You can't hold You can't hold a chainsaw manufacturer responsible for what Jason and Friday the 13th were doing it, all right? The law around AI in general is still largely unsettled and will definitely change over time. Right now, no one really has solid answers to much of anything. The key takeaway for us as end users of AI is to treat it like a chainsaw. Ask yourself the golden question of AI. You're starting to use this in your company. What could go wrong? What are the risks if an AI deployment goes off the rails? Just like it's a bad idea, generally, to use a chainsaw to say, do surgery, although that was actually what it was invented for, believe it or not. It was invented for C-sections. Yikes, right? But just like it's a bad idea to use a chainsaw to do surgery, there are plenty of use cases where you should not use AI right now, like hiring and firing people, autonomous weapons, all those things. Not a great use of AI right now. Speaking of which, employment was another major area where the folks asking the questions didn't really know what the questions were that they were asking, and even the AI experts didn't have solid answers. No one does. Economists estimate between 30 and 50% of jobs will be impacted, perhaps even lost to AI over time, as well as creation of lots of new jobs, most of which we can't imagine right now. And I've changed my thinking on this to be a lot more optimistic, and here's why. I was reading up on this recently. The invention of the cotton gin, or the cotton engine, by Eli Whitney in 1793 made cotton go from a pain-in-the-ass crop to harvest and spin to a hugely profitable one. The net effect of the cotton gin was a dramatic increase in the farming and picking of cotton, powered mostly through slavery in the southern USA. A technological change created a massive boom in the slave trade. But the lesson here is the asymmetry in labor in part of the supply chain had dramatic effects on the rest of it, as well as terrible human costs. But that asymmetry created more jobs in the rest of the supply chain to keep up with the now machine output of being able to refine cotton that quickly. It is probable that we will see AI impacts having asymmetric labor impacts as well. Think about it for a second. If you mandated, say internally as company policy, human editors need to fact check what AI is creating, right? So you're going to automate your corporate blog, hand it over to AI, but human editors have to fact check it. And yes, you lose a lot of writers, right? Your machines are now writing. But as AI scales up, suddenly we need a lot more editors. Right? These are ordered effects. The first order effect of automating away your blog is to reduce the number of writers. The second order effect in this example is to dramatically increase the number of editors, because instead of having 10 articles a day to edit, now your editors suddenly have 10,000. Right? So you now have an asymmetry in the supply chain that everything else has to keep up with. And at some point, either at the beginning or the end of supply chain, where presumably your supply chain interacts with human beings, you're going to need more humans. This is a critical point to think about in your own information supply chain. If you use AI to scale certain parts, where are the next logical bottlenecks you'll need more resources to successfully harness the outputs of that AI, right? If your AI is super efficient and takes this one task and takes it from 4 hours to 2 minutes, well, then you can do more of that. And if you can do more of that, then what's the next step in that process? And how many more people are you going to need in that next step to handle the volume that AI can create? Right? I think there's some room for optimism there. The final area of discussion in the hearings, and one that was largely fruitless, was about AI safety and morals. This is an area fraught with problems because no one can agree on what is moral. Think about it for a second. Even in a relatively homogenous culture, there's still major disagreements about what is right and wrong. Whose morals are correct? Christians? Muslims? Buddhists? Atheists? Satanists? Who decides what is right and wrong? We live in a world now where there's such hyper-partisanship and polarization of opinion on literally everything that we can't agree on anything. We are, no joke, fighting over cartoon depictions of candy, for goodness sakes. What we do know about AI models is they are trained on our data. Copyrighted or not, if it's publicly visible, at least one of the AI models probably has been trained on it. And that means that all of our human foibles and flaws are in those models as well. Everything good about us, everything bad about us, everything that encompasses humanity is in these models to some degree. And that means vastly conflicting morals. Right? It is impossible, and it will remain impossible for us to create the same universal AI models that have any kind of morality, especially as we continue to churn out more and more disinformation. For example, Russian propagandists are doing their level best right now to pollute the internet with as much anti-Ukrainian content as possible. Hundreds of attempts by Russian saboteurs have been made to try to create code in Twitter's now open source recommendation algorithms to classify anything Ukrainian as government-sponsored propaganda and reduce its visibility. So far, they've not been successful. Some of that garbage, and it is garbage, let's be clear, will inevitably find its way into large language models the same way that other hate speech does. So what's the solution here? How do we prevent Russians or other bad guys from corrupting our AI models? This is the one area where the witnesses and the elected officials were in general agreement, and I am in agreement with them as well. Radical transparency. If an organization is publishing an AI model, it must fully disclose and publicly disclose what that model was trained on in a very granular fashion. No more of this trained on thousands of books. Okay, which books? Which specific books and which editions? Not social media discussions, but okay, which posts on Reddit did you use in this model? Right? Having that granularity is important. We don't accept, nutrition labels that say stuff, right? Especially in places like the EU. You are required to disclose specifics. The same should be true of AI models and the fine-tuned models. Someone who's doing fine-tuning should equally be required, if the model is going to be made available for commercial or public use, to disclose everything in the fine-tuning data set so we can all see exactly what the model is learning. Now, you will get some significant opposition from the big model makers because that is going to be an extremely expensive documentation operation. But this is how we will solve some of the liability issues around AI as well. Right now, we don't know how the models were trained, right? The model, basically, the nutrition label says stuff. Okay. So we don't realistically know. We can't realistically say whether a model should be liable for its output. But if we required full disclosure of the data a model was trained on, we could absolutely hold accountable a tech company for training on content that's harmful or false. We could mandate, for example, the exclusion of patently false and wrong information, like content claiming the Earth is flat when it is verifiably not flat. And companies that do not exclude patently wrong information in the training data sets would be more liable for the things that their models do wrong, right? You could say your model was trained on bad data and therefore you are liable for the consequences of this model more so than a company that says, here's the data we trained on. It's clean. It's good. You can say, okay, then your model hallucinated, but we're not going to hold you accountable for those hallucinations as much because you did the right thing and you put the good stuff in. You kept the bad stuff out. This is where some of the cottage industries are going to spring up around AI. Opportunities for businesses and savvy entrepreneurs, maybe you, to make a lot of money. A lot of money. There is money to be made, especially for folks who have backgrounds in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to help audit models, especially the training data that goes into models. There's money to be made in the auditing processes themselves. There is money to be made in monitoring models and doing independent third-party validation of model outputs. There's huge, huge money to be made in curating training data sets that meet specific standards. Voluntary standards at first, until, the industry or government gets it together. But there's money to be made there. There's money to be made in the national security and policy implications of widespread use of large language models, particularly around propaganda and disinformation. There's money to be made in identifying disinformation using AI. AI is an incredibly powerful tool that has no manual and no guidelines right now, and people are running around like 4-year-olds with chainsaws. If we want to continue making use of its power, we need to better understand its capabilities and regulate the inputs and the outputs, what goes into making AI, and how people use it for us to succeed with it in the long term. As we have seen with hostile foreign powers like Russia, there are already attempts to use it to subvert nations and cause tremendous damage with it. So the sooner we figure things out, the better. All right, what else is happening this week? 42 days until Google Analytics 4 is the only version of Google Analytics. If you have not taken the course, it's in the newsletter. If you have not done the switch over, hit reply or go to trustinsights.ai/contact and we'll get you sorted out. This week on the live stream, did a fantastic bake-off of 4 different generative AI models. We used GPT-4, aka ChatGPT, Bing, Bard, and GPT for All. And I was really surprised at the results. They were not what I expected. So go watch that. It's on YouTube. There's a link right in the blog post. But it was really, really interesting. We're going to repeat that bake-off on a fairly frequent basis because these models are changing fast and doing some different stuff. Let's see. Jobs this week. New ones. Data scientist for large language model generative AI at Pivotal Life Sciences. That was a really interesting job description to read, by the way. How Life Sciences is thinking about generative AI. Data scientist at Holiday Check, digital marketing analyst at Micro Center, machine learning engineer for PyTorch imaging modeling at Tower 33, research science at the Newark Board of Education, senior data scientist at Flagship, senior digital analyst at NPR, and senior digital analytics implementation engineer at Virgin Media. So lots of good stuff happening there. In other news this week, in your news, developing a consistent brand voice on social media, Montana becomes the first U.S. state to issue a full TikTok ban. Do the people who make these laws just not understand how the internet works? Are they like still in the it's a series of tubes phase of things? Because clearly this is not, it's like Utah banning Pornhub. Good luck. That's not how the internet works. People don't understand the internet was designed by the Department of Defense to to basically be a communications network in the case of nuclear war, decentralized so that bombing one place would not disrupt communications. Censorship is seen as a technical failure on the internet, and the internet routes around it. Anyway, other stories, how Gen Z is rewriting the beauty industry rulebook and how brands need to adapt to stay relevant. Google's helpful content update can demote and promote content. Tons and tons and tons of all things AI, of course, which is no surprise here. And a lot of concern about the economy based on possible USA default, downbeat economy, truck driving issues, all sorts of stuff happening. So that's the news for this week. A lot of things going on. I'm headed out to Chicago in just a couple days for a B2B Ignite. I'll be doing a talk there on, you guessed it, generative AI, followed by MACON at the end of July, the Marketing AI Conference in Cleveland. Hope to see you there for that one. ISBM in Chicago and Content Marketing World in DC. So exciting times there. And Marketing Profs B2B Forum here in Boston. And a couple other things that are still working out the paperwork on. So lots and lots of stuff coming up. I hope if you're going to be at one of those events, stop by, say hi. Be happy to chat with you. That is the news for this week. Thank you for your attention and for being here and for enjoying some human-made content. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.